Welcome back to our discussion on web applications using the Go programming language. So what I want to do right now is to look at error handling. Okay. So the last thing we did was to um, handle form validation. However, keep in mind that we still have a bunch of validation code inside our handlers. So eventually we want to do a bit more refactoring later on to move these into their own area and only call them from within the handler. But for now, I want to talk about error handling. Specifically, how do we log, how do we record uh, our messages? Okay, so if I go to main, okay, we basically have errors. So for example, um, when I want to display an error uh, here, um, here, okay, we could say log.printf, right? And we've seen this when you start the server, this message is displayed. Now, if there is an error message, then we could also display that error here. Okay, so it turns out that we need to be able to differentiate between the different types of messages, meaning, is it a message that is informing me of some event, or is it a message that is informing me of some error? Okay, so it's sort of a trivial change, but nonetheless, it's actually quite useful in terms of diagnosis. All right, so what I'm going to do, I will create a new logger. Okay, for those of you who, well, you should have already gone over um, the tutorial. So we're going to create a logger. Okay, and a logger is simply uh, something that allows me to write a log message to. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to create an info logger, and I'm going to call it info log. And to create a new logger, we're going to say log.new. Okay. And log.new, if you notice, it returns a pointer to a logger. Okay, so it creates a new logger, and the out variable sets the destination to which log data will be written. Okay, so we want to say that we want to write messages for this logger to std out. Okay, standard out. Now we must also specify what we want to prepend to the message. Do we want to say that this is an error message? Do we want to say that this is an informational message? Do we want to say some other thing? So if it's just information, we could always say info. Okay, let's put a space. And finally, after we have specified what kind of message it is, we need to specify the flags, any flags, meaning what exactly should the message be comprised of. And so we want the message to have added to it the local date. Okay, we use a pipe. We also want the local time to be added to the message. We also want the file the message originated from. Okay? And of course, which line number. Okay, so L short file. So L short file will basically tell me which file, which line. Which file, which line. Okay, so this is how I create a logger. So info log will be responsible for logging anything that is not an error. Now, if I do have an error, I want to log that into a different file. Okay, remember, we're talking about log files. So let's just call this error log. Okay, and error log will be sent to std_error, which is the standard error. And we want to add in front of those messages the word error. Makes sense. And then, of course, we want to the date, the time, and the file location. All right. Okay. Well, actually, let's get rid of this. We don't really need file location since we don't really have an error here. Okay. So only an error thrown would have an associated file and line number. If it doesn't have an error, if it's just a regular informational message, just display it along with the date and time. Yeah, that makes more sense. All right, so these are my two loggers. So here's the thing, how do we use them? Well, normally we said log, okay? And so this would go to the default logger that Go has set up. Likewise, when you said log, also the default logger. So what we want to tell Go now is, you know what, I don't want you to use your default logger, because remember the default logger does not differentiate what type of message it is. So we had to create our own. So we're gonna say, all right, Go, from now on, I want to use this logger for messages that are just information. Okay? And so now I will say info log.printf. All right? And whenever there is an actual error, okay, such as fatal or panic, I will say, Go, I want you to use the error logger. And so whenever I have an error, I will see error message added. Whenever I have a informational message, I will see info added. Okay. So this basically is the only change I want to make. So we're just sort of giving our error messages, since not every message is an error, more fine-tuned. Now to see this in action, all I'm going to do is to run it. So I'm going to say go run. Okay, and I'm going to use the default port 4000, and I'm going to use the default database connection credentials. Okay, so notice now we have info, which tells me that this message here is just an informational message. It's not an error message. Now, how can we check to see if something is an error? Well, let's just do a simple check. Let's open another terminal and let's try to run our server again. Well, remember, you can't run the application on the same port, right? So if I just leave this like this and I say, okay, I want it to run again on port 4000. Well, port 4000 has already been occupied here. All right, it's currently running. So if I come down here and I say, okay, I want to run this program on port 4000 as well. So it will print out the info, right, starting the server, but then wait, there's an error. Port 4000 already in use, and then it exits. So right away, I can see that it is an error, right? And this helps too, because let's say you have a lot of log messages, and let's say you decide to write these uh, messages to a file. Okay, you write both info and you write error to one file. Well, it would be kind of hard if they didn't have any prefix. But once they have a prefix, you could simply use grep to kind of search for what you want. So another good use of using proper logging names. Okay, that's it for, oh, there's one thing I want to mention. By default, the server that we have created, okay, if there are any error messages, okay, from the server, maybe you have some handler error or whatever, it will still use the generic logger. Okay, so if I come here, okay, if I just want to show you our http.server structure, and to show you that it does have a field whereby we can tell it which logger to use. All right, if we don't specify the logger, it's going to use the default logger, which is not what we want. We would want it to use the error logger that we just created. So let me just show you. Okay, so say go http.server. All right. So if we come here, okay, server. Notice it has address, which we have used. It has a handler, which we have used. And if we come down here, it has an error log field. So error log specifies an optional logger for errors accepting connections, unexpected behavior from handlers, and underlying file system errors. So if I don't provide a logger, then it will use the default logger, which again does not have any kind of distinction. Okay, so we will use our error log field. So I'm going to come down here and I will use, oops, here, error log. And error log will be initialized with our error log logger. So now, whenever there is some error message from, let's say, our handlers, it will also display the error message in front, as well as which line of code caused that error. Okay, so let's save this. Of course, if we try to do this, it will give me error message. Great. So that is there. Okay, let me run my server again. Okay, good. So everything works, and that brings me to the end of this lesson. So again, we were just creating customized loggers, right? And this is something that you generally tend to do. Okay, in the next lesson, I want to look at the next major thing that we have been talking about, which is how do we centralize all these error messages that we have in our handlers. So remember, I kept saying that every time there's an error, I have to write all of this code. I have to write all of this code. So what we want to do is to be able to call a function which deals with all of this for us. All right. So that's the next thing we want to do, how to centralize our error handling when it comes to the function handlers. Okay, I hope that made sense. I'll see you in the next lesson.